Sorry, I got to find the place again. Oh, man, what did I do?
Any dedications, Rav Kevin?
Not today. Any of you guys? Oh, there we go.
But maybe to those 3 guys that got killed on Thursday last week.
Yes, yeah.
They have an easy transition and then the Shumas get elevated and all that.
Yeah,
and their families have peace and simchas.
There's actually been, I think in the last 6 weeks or something, like 28 people have died or something like that. It's quite a big, or 20 people. It's quite 18 maybe, but it's quite a large number in the last month or 6 weeks. There's been a lot of terrorists to all of them, actually. I think that dedication should be to all.
And a refer for the ones that were injured. There's some ones seriously injured also.
Correct.
1 or 2 of them are seriously injured, so refer for them too.
Amen.
Okay, should I start again?
No, we'll start, yeah.
Okay, so okay, it's continuing from where I left off.
Wherever you want to go, we trust you.
Okay, so if you cooked food on Shabbos, for Shabbos, you had it Friday night, and you cool it down, put it in the fridge. You want to have it Shabbos day. It's already cold, so you want to basically reheat it. It is forbidden to place cold food, dry or liquid, cooked or uncooked, directly on a fire or anywhere on a blech where the food could possibly reach the temperature of Yad Soledet Bo, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, and it says, according to some poskim, place cold food on the edge of the blech, far enough from the flame to ensure that the food will never reach the temperature of Yad Soledet Bo. Okay, that's like a stove type thing, it seems. It is permitted to place dry, cold meat, chicken, kugel on top of a pot of soup of cholent, which is on the fire in a crock pot, even if the heat source is not covered, or directly on top of a radiator, even if the food will become piping hot. Some poskim hold it is permitted to place such food on the lid of an empty pot or an empty overturned pan placed over the fire, but only if the heat source is properly covered. Others forbid using an empty pot or pan completely. Okay, then this one here, which is, then it probably applies to all of us. Okay, let's just skip the last one about cooked liquids and the Yad Soledet Bo. Whenever food is reheated on Shabbos, the food item should not be completely wrapped and sealed in aluminium foil. Instead, the edges of the foil should be left slightly apart to avoid the prohibition of hatmana. Now, sealed in aluminium foil. Now, I wonder if those are those containers. So it says here, should not be completely wrapped. Instead, the edges of the foil should be left slightly apart to avoid the prohibition of hatmana. So it can't be totally sealed. It just maybe the edges must be open. I didn't know that. I actually did exactly the opposite of what it says here on Shabbat and for the last week and the week before. Last week. I didn't know that. Okay. I thought if it's fully cooked, you could return it to the heat. I don't know if you guys, I thought it was like, as long as it was fully cooked, which it was, then you can, even if it's sealed, return it to the heat. I mean, completely sealed.
I learn every day.
Yeah.
Okay. So, good. I'm going to share the screen a sec. All right. Kevin, will you kindly do the honors and read the Mishnah?
Of course. Okay. If the fact that one stole an ox or sheep was established by the testimony of 2 witnesses, and the fact that he then slaughtered or sold the stolen animal was established by their testimony as well, or by the testimony of 2 other witnesses, he pays the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. The Mishnah continues. If one sold an ox or sheep and then sold it on Shabbos, or if one stole an ox or sheep and then stole it for idolatry, or if one stole an ox or sheep and then slaughtered it on Yom Kippur, or if one stole an ox or sheep from his father and then slaughtered or sold it, and his father died afterwards, or if one stole an ox or sheep and slaughtered it and then consecrated the slaughtered animal, in all these cases he pays the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. If one stole an ox or sheep and then slaughtered it to use the meat for therapeutic purposes or as food for dogs, or if he slaughters it and it is found to be a treifa, or if he slaughters it as a non-consecrated animal in the temple courtyard. In all these cases, he pays the fourfold or fivefold payment. Rav Shimon exempts him from the fourfold or fivefold payment in these last two cases. So, Damon, these last two cases is it's a treifa and it's a non-consecrated animal. Those are the last two cases.
That's
correct. Is that what he's saying?
That's exactly what he's saying. So, firstly, that was very, very well read. I'd like to bring your attention to the following aspect that you guys just would have to bear in mind. The first thing I'd like to let you know is that whenever there's a case in this particular Mishnah about a 4 or 5-fold payment, you must know there's no kimlei b'di rabba minai. So what do we mean by that? Is that the lesser penalty is waived for the greater penalty. Meaning that if you slaughtered an animal, okay, for idol worship practice or slaughtered it on the Sabbath, that thief is liable for the death penalty, and that same act that causes the death penalty occurs simultaneously at the same time period at which he becomes eligible to the 4 or 5-fold. And since he's getting the death penalty, we waiver the lower penalty. So in the Mishnah, it talks about where you sell the animal on Shabbos, and why in that case is there the 4 or 5-fold payment? Quite simply because there's no death penalty. It's not recommended, but there's certainly no death penalty as far as that's concerned. And what was a chiddush for me was that there's no death penalty if you sell it for somebody using it for idolatry. Now, that's a surprise. I thought, okay, if you sell it to a non-Jew for idolatry, that's one thing. But if you sell it to a Jew for idolatry, I'm surprised there's no death penalty. But it would make sense under one premise, is that there can be no agent through transgression, which means that if you hire a hitman, you're responsible in Shemayim, but that hitman should have known better. And therefore, he created the act, and grama, which is indirect, we never give the death penalty for. Does that make sense? So obviously, if you sell it and the other Jew uses it for idolatry, in Shemayim, I wouldn't want to be that person, but they don't give the death penalty because it wasn't used in idolatry practices as such. It was a commercial deal. Also, I learned something. I always thought, guys, before I did this Mishnah, that Yom Kippur mimicked the halachas of Shabbos more than Yom Tov. And I assumed that if you slaughter an animal on Shabbat and that person gets the death penalty, surely if you slaughter on Yom Kippur, that person gets the death penalty. It's not the case. So in that way, it's treated less like a Shabbos and more leniently. Does that make sense? So we're going to deal with each of these issues in succession. Yeah, sure. Ask whatever you need.
But they use these animals for the sacrifices.
Okay.
Shabbos, there were sacrifices, Yom Kippur, even, yeah, so.
Exactly.
I wonder if they slaughtered them, yeah.
No, that's a good point, but that was reserved for the Kohen to do. I think a normal person wasn't just allowed to slaughter on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to slaughter on the Sabbath. That's a death penalty offense. It's one thing if it's part of karbonis and part of practice, but not in order to eat. You can't slaughter an animal, but you can sell it. Meaning you're not allowed to either, but it's not a death penalty offense like slaughtering. But we can't confuse that with karbonis and kohanim practices. What's interesting to ask is when the laws of Sabbath were given, initially there was a case where there was Pinchas that before the Mishkan was built, that people were doing sacrifices in their own premises before there was a common Mishkan. And when the Mishkan was there, there were still 2 tribes that were doing it, and they thought they were doing idolatrous practices, so the 10 tribes were ready to go to war with the 2 tribes, and Pinchas sorted it out peacefully. So, we learned from there that people also did their own sort of sacrifices, but certainly not on Shabbos, the lay person, that's for sure. All right. So listen, the bottom line is, how does this relate to the stuff? Is we're talking about when a thief becomes eligible for the 4 or 5-fold for selling or slaughtering an animal, and when that is waived with kimle b'di rabba mineh, where we waiver the lesser penalty in deference to the greater penalty, because we only give one penalty, and that's a kapora for both activities. Okay, providing the person makes a proper teshuvah. All right, so let's just get straight into the Gemara without any further ado. The Gemara cites the clause of the Mishnah that reads, if one stole an animal and then sold it on Shabbat, he pays the 4 or 5-fold payment. Okay? Now, the Gemara notes a contradiction between our Mishnah and the Brisa, because that was in our Mishnah. Why is he paying the 4 or 5-fold payment? Because to steal an animal and sell it on Shabbos is not a death penalty act. But we learn in the following brisa, if one stole an animal and then sold it on Shabbat, he's exempt from the 4 or 5-fold payment. So then you come into the conclusion, well, maybe then if he's exempt, is kimle b'di rabba mineh play, or is there another factor? So Rami Bava Kamma said, when it was taught in that brisa that the thief is exempt when he sells a stolen animal on the Sabbath, it refers to where the buyer said to the seller, stroke thief, cut off yourself a fig from my fig tree, and that which you have stolen shall therefore be acquired by me. So what are we talking about here? Is, guys, I've got this tap that's dripping, and it's like Chinese water torture. Give me 1 second to squish this thing. I'll be 1 second.
I'm going to the bathroom for a second as well.
So it's exciting, Kev, you coming back.
Yeah.
So what we are saying here is that the brisa differs from the Mishnah, and Rami Bava Kamma said that when it taught in the brisa that the thief sells the stolen animal on Shabbat, of which there's no death penalty offense, guys, for doing that. It refers to where the buyer that bought the stolen animal said to the thief who was selling it to him, cut off for yourself a fig from my fig tree, and that which you have stolen shall thereby be acquired by me. So what we are saying is here, is the thief agreed to sell the stolen animal to the buyer for a fig, or for a certain amount of fruit. The buyer then told the thief to take a fig from his tree as payment for the stolen animal. So what you've got to note here is that the buyer never cut the fig from his own tree to break Shabbos. He said to the thief, if you want to sell the stolen animal, you can have the equivalent of the produce worth, but then you'd need to take the produce. So the thief, by cutting the fig off the fig tree, effected the sale of the stolen animal and became liable to the 4-fold or 5-fold payment, while committing simultaneously the capital effect or the capital offense of cutting a fruit from a tree on the Sabbath. So we apply the rule of he stands liable to the penalty greater than it, kimle b'di rabba mineh, and the thief is exempt from the 4 or 5-fold payment, according to Rashi, because for cutting the produce off a tree, he gets the death penalty. Obviously, in that case, it would be with see, there's one thing I don't understand that maybe you guys could explain to me. Is that we learned with Rav Simcha Steinhauer that you need witnesses. You also need hanoah, which is a warning about the penalty that would. There's even a specific thing that you have to say exactly the death penalty that would occur, and other cases where you just have to say if you carry on doing this, that person would get a death penalty. But there certainly has to be witnesses and warnings, etc. So how does anybody have this illicit transaction? I understand how the 4 or 5-fold payment is incurred by the transaction of selling, but I don't understand why that would be done simultaneously at the act of breaking Shabbos, because in order to be eligible from the death penalty, I looked into this, he would have to be warned. There'd have to be witnesses. Okay, so the only thing that I can think of is there is a law of Kim Leiber di Rabbi Minai, which we learned in Sanhedrin, about a thief that breaks in a home, and at the same time as he breaks in, tramples and breaks a barrel of wine. And therefore we say, because his life is at risk, because the homeowner, upon seeing him, is not sure if the thief's going to kill him, and therefore will try and kill the thief first. And therefore, during that period, even if the homeowner doesn't actually kill the thief, his life is in danger to the extent that we still apply Kim Leiber di Rabbi Minai, which means that even if there weren't witnesses or Hanoah to effect the death penalty, because if he had, under the right circumstances, that sort of pre-warning and witnesses, he would be eligible for the death penalty. Therefore, Kim Leiber di Rabbi Minai still applies. That's the closest that I could find to deal with that particular problem I had, guys. Okay, so Tosfot and the other Rishonim raised the question as to how the sale of the animal is effected through the cutting of the fig, because this was the interesting part, is that kinyan kesef, in other words, you acquire something through money or an item of value, in this case the carcass itself, is effective only for the sale, though, of land, not for the sale of movables. So it's interesting, is that although money is considered a movable, if you don't have that currency, then the only thing that you can do with the kinyan kesef is exchange land for that item for some reason. Okay, so they're saying then, basically, according to Tosfot and other Rishonim, how does this transaction even take place? Because the sale of movables is not effective when the buyer pays for them, but only when he takes physical possession of the item by lifting it. We've got that concept when we lift the Torah, Gavin, Hagbah. So it's the same thing. You're taking physical possession of the item by lifting it. Or if it's an animal, by pulling it into his possession, which is Mashiach. So how then does paying a fig to the seller affect the sale? So Tosfot suggests that the buyer and the seller meant to effect an acquisition using a kinyan kalifin, which is actually an exchange, which you can do, which is effective even for the sale of movables. So the fig wasn't given as payment for the animal, but rather in exchange for the animal. That's in Kedushin in the 28th daf. So the bottom line is that when the thief broke Shabbos by taking his exchange of the quantity of figs for the carcass he stole, he's effectively liable under the right circumstances for getting the death penalty. So even if it isn't actualized, he still gets to be waived from the 4 or 5-fold payment. So the Gemara objects, and they say, but since if the buyer will sue the thief before us in court for the return of the fig, or maybe for the agreed upon sale item, we will not say to the thief, go pay him, since he is liable to pay with his life for taking the fig. And this sale too is not a sale, even if he wishes to keep as part of the agreement and go through with the sale. Okay, so what it's saying is, guys, generally when one takes something that belongs to another person, he becomes liable to return it. Or if you take the case of a sale, if you pay money for something, you're entitled to get the goods in return. If you don't, you can sue the person. But when the seller desecrated the Sabbath, when he cut off the fig, the rule is he stands liable to the penalty greater than it, exempts him from legal liability to return anything for the fig. So, for example, if he would refuse to go with the sale, in other words, he definitely takes the figs, but he doesn't decide to give the animal carcass in exchange to the buyer, and the buyer sues him in court, there's no transaction that really took place. Why? Because since he's taking the fig doesn't obligate him to make compensation for it, because it's as though he received nothing from the buyer. Okay? So the brisa cannot be referring to this particular case, because the buyer told the thief to effect the sale by picking a fig, because the sale isn't effective altogether. So in other words, what we're saying is as follows, is that You can't, there's no effective transaction of a sale that happens on Shabbos. It's not recognized. And since it's not recognized, and even if it was, what are you going to sue the guy for? If the 4 or 5-fold penalty is waived, any other monetary civil litigation case is waived in response to the capital case taking precedence. And since that's the case, then the buyer, if he doesn't get his animal in return for the fix he's getting, doesn't have a law case. And since there's no law case, there's no effective sale. So that's what the Gemara is saying, is that, what do you mean there's an effective sale? It doesn't even come into play. So how could you say that this would be a case where you've got Kim Lebedi Rabbi Minay anyway? How would you effect that the sale took place? Because in order for a sale to take place, you would need protection of the buyer to be able to sue in court the seller if he didn't fulfill his obligations. And since he cannot do it in this case, that's not a proper sale. So how does this case even start? Okay. So the Gemara accepts the objection and maybe suggests like a slightly different resolution. So Rav Papa said, the Brisa refers to where the buyer said to the thief, throw what you have stolen in my courtyard, and that which you have stolen shall thereby be acquired by me. Okay? So what it's basically saying is the thief and the buyer decided, okay, right, they've worked on a sale price for the stolen animal. And the buyer told the thief to effect the sale by throwing the stolen animal into the buyer's courtyard, his property, so that this way he knows he's going to get the animal. So the thief did so on Shabbat by lifting the animal in the public domain and heaving it into the buyer's enclosure which is what, guys? A private, guys?
Domain.
Exactly.
Private domain.
Yes, and therefore if you take something from a public domain to private or private to a public, what's the penalty for that? With the right amount of witnesses and warning, guys, what's the penalty? It's a death penalty.
Sentence.
Yes. So
What is that? The death?
What?
What penalty did you say?
I'm saying if you break the 39 melachos on purpose with the right sort of warnings, etc., one is eligible for the death penalty.
Because it's Shabbos. Sorry, I forgot. Yes, correct.
Yeah. So what he's saying is, all right, buy and say the buyer says, listen, I agree to your price. I'll give you X amount of produce, or I'll give you X in return for the animal that you stole. Throw it over the fence and let it land in my garage. So therefore the thief has broken Shabbos, and then the law of Kim Lebedi Rabbi Minay happened. Why? Because the thief became simultaneously liable to the death penalty for desecrating Shabbat by transporting from public domain to private, and at the same time for the 4 or 5-fold payment for selling the stolen animal. So therefore, that's a case where you've got Kim Lebedi Rabbi Minay, meaning that in that case, because the sale actually was mixed with breaking Shabbos, that's where there would be a 4 or 5-fold payment. That's not eligible. Again, guys, what are we trying to prove? Kevin, our Mishnah now says that if you sell an animal on Shabbos, there's no death penalty, therefore you're eligible for a 4 or 5-fold payment. We then learn a brisa that if you sell an animal on Shabbos, you're not eligible for the 4 or 5-fold payment, which assumes then that there is a death penalty. So how can there be a death penalty? There can only be a death penalty if, as was suggested by Bava Kamma, you are breaking Shabbos at the same time that the transaction takes place. You're falling asleep, Kevin. So therefore, in that particular case, there would be no 4 or 5-fold penalty. So Bava Kamma, basically that case doesn't work. Why doesn't that case work so far? Is because there's no sale that's taken place. because in order for a sale to take place, you need legal protection that if the sale goes awry, that you can sue the seller for not having fulfilled his obligations when the buyer's paid. And since that case isn't legal, since that you can't do that with Kim Leber di Rabba Minay, the sale isn't effective because you've got no legal recourse. In this case, it's different because it's not picking the fig, which resulted in a kinyan, an exchange, that caused it. It's a act of throwing it from the public domain to the private, where the buyer gets the animal. So then the buyer is not going to sue the seller because he got the goods for what he's giving. He's got the animal carcass for what he's exchanging for the goods. So there's no court case. There's no issue there. And secondly, it wasn't the sale that created Kim Leber di Rabba Minay. It happened to be simultaneously, but it was the act of breaking Shabbos by carrying from the lifting from the public domain to the private domain. Okay?
Can I just stop you for a second, Damon?
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to ask you something. Just the buyer, what's the ramifications to the buyer? Because the buyer knows, surely he knows he's buying from a thief because it's been thrown over the wall, it's all dodgy. So what happens to him?
Firstly, he doesn't get the death penalty for encouraging the breaking of Shabbos. In terms of if the sale is dissolved, I have no idea, but it looks like not. Otherwise, this would have been a problem in this case. And in the next world, he's liable, but he's not the direct cause. It's groma, it's indirect. He's not. You can only one can only get that sort of penalty if you cause it directly. Okay.
Good answer. Thank you. Yeah,
sure.
Sure.
So when you do akira, which is uprooting an article from one domain to another, that's when it kicks. That's when it kicks in. Okay. So the Gemara suggests, with whom does this brisa accord? It accords only with Rabbi Akiva, who says that something contained in the airspace of a domain is legally viewed as if it had come to rest there. But if you say that it accords with the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva, why is he exempt from the fourfold or fivefold payment? Why, as soon as the stolen animal reaches the airspace of the courtyard of his house, the buyer acquires it, but with respect to desecrating the Sabbath, the thief is not liable until it reaches the ground. So there's a problem with this because Rav Papa says, look, this is a case where there's no legal dispute because the buyer gets his share of what he was looking to buy thrown in his courtyard, so he's got acquisition of it. So there is no court case. And even if Kim Leber di Rabba Minay happens, it's valid because he's got the stock. And then the seller obviously has given over the item to the buyer. Then the buyer can give it to him. But generally, it's not the seller that sues the buyer. It's the buyer that sues the seller because he never got what he paid for. So this isn't a problem. While he broke Shabbos by throwing it over from a public domain to private, he effects the sale at that time and therefore is not eligible to the 4 or 5-fold payment in the brisa. Okay? Because he broke Shabbos at the same time. So, what we're saying is there's a problem with this, with Rav Papa's discussion, because it would only accord with Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva turns around and says, look, this is an issue about timing and airspace. So according to Rabbi Akiva, something contained in the airspace of a domain is legally viewed as if it's come to rest there. What do we mean? Well, guys, if you look at gravity, it says it in Gemara Shabbos 96a, that according to Rabbi Akiva, if you throw an object from a private domain into another private domain through the airspace of an intervening public domain, you're liable for transporting an object from a private domain into a public domain. So what I'm saying is I live next door, Gavin, and we've got a public road between me, and I throw an item over the wall to Gavin. Now, Rabbi Akiva is saying that's a problem because that's transgressing Shabbat. Because, Kev, you're falling asleep. It's going from my private space through to a public domain in the air, and then into Gavin's place where he catches the article, right? So Rabbi Akiva said, no, it's a problem, because if it enters the airspace, that's breaking Shabbos. But the rabbis don't say that. The rabbis say the problem is where it comes to rest. So if I throw it directly over the wall and Gavin catches it and there's a public domain in between, there's no issue. If my aim sucks and it lands on the ground, I've got a problem there, because then it means I've gone from a private domain to a public. But if it happens to shoot over the wall and it doesn't land in the public domain, it's gone from private to private. There's no issue, according to the rabbis. According to Rabbi Akiva, it's a problem. But it works well in our Mishnah, in our Bryce, according to Rav Papa. Because Rav Papa said, look, at the time the seller throws over the carcass, the seller meaning the thief, the stolen carcass, it lands in the buyer's property, but the transaction happens in midair. Because the minute it's safely within the private domain, he's going to get it eventually. So Rabbi Akiva said, fine, it's a simultaneous act, we get it. And therefore there's no 4 or 5-fold payment, because when he breaks Shabbos, the thief, he's eligible to the death penalty. So he doesn't have to pay the 4 or 5-fold penalty for selling an animal that he stole. Okay? But the rabbis say there's a problem, because they say the timing is different. The rabbis are basically saying, look, yes, he is breaking Shabbos while it's at the point where it lands, because the rabbis are saying that when it lands, at that point, it's gone from a public to a private, but only when it lands. Rabbi Akiva said while it's in the air, if it's going to land, gravity is going to hit. But just give me one sec. So when it lands, at that point, the rabbis say he broke Shabbos. But the transaction actually occurred in midair. Because what happens is the minute it's landed over the fence in the buyer's property, it's going to land on the ground. But we determine a financial transaction at a different level of timing to Shabbos, because the rabbis were very strict not to give death penalties and other things. So they made it more lenient. The rabbis said actually had to land. Whereas for a financial transaction, in order to effect an acquisition, it was fine in midair, as long as gravity was eventually going to take effect. You could work out the transaction from that point. But there's a difference in implication. So whenever anything is much more serious, the rabbis say, listen, it's got to land. And therefore, because it wasn't occurring at the same time period, there would be an eligibility for a 4 or 5-fold payment, because the transaction happened before, because remember, if a thief sells a stolen item, he's eligible for the 4 or 5-fold payment, depending if it's an ox or a sheep or an ox. But he only broke Shabbos when the animal landed in the actual private domain. So therefore, it was not simultaneous. That's why he owes the 4 or 5-fold payment, because Kimlay Badi Rabbamin doesn't take effect. Yes, he will get the death penalty, but that occurred after the financial payment. So he pays the money and he loses his life. So we're saying it's a problem because it doesn't accord with the rabbis. What were you going to ask, Kevin?
Saying, doesn't the acquisition actually depend on a kinyan, the physical, if the person actually holds it, the financial?
No, so there are different types of kinyan. The one is hakba, where you're holding it above, like an apotiki, a slave. You hold him above you and you say, "You man." Okay. The problem is if you 5 foot something like me and you're ending up getting a slave that's 200 kilograms. I don't know how I'd lift him up. But anyway, that being said, then mashicha is when you draw an animal towards you, where you're steering the ownership of the bit of a horse or an animal with the reins and you're pulling the animal's horns. That's something different. Then you've got a kinyan of an exchange of money or property. Then you've got an exchange, which is a different sort of kinyan. So what we are saying here is the transaction took place because the buyer got the goods from the seller. So there'll be no court case, it's fine. But there's a problem because it accords well with Rabbi Akiva that says the minute it enters the airspace, it's considered have the transaction taking effect for the buyer and seller, as well as the breaking of Shabbos. But the rabbis say only when that object lands in the private domain do we consider him having broken Shabbos, because of the example of me throwing an orange across my property to Gavin's, and there's a road in between, a public road. Says that's not landing in a public domain from a private. So therefore the rabbis would say it doesn't work, because the breaking of Shabbos is after the financial transaction, because the financial transaction occurred when it was in the airspace, because we're more lenient. Because the seller's not going to get the property back. It's already left his hands and is in the airspace of the private domain. It's going to eventually land. But we're not that stringent when it comes to breaking Shabbos, because we don't want to give the death penalty just for mid-air jobs. So in other words, the financial transaction took place in the air, but the breaking of Shabbos only happened when the animal's carcass landed. Therefore, it's not Kim Labadi Rabba Minay, because the transaction occurred before breaking Shabbos. Therefore, the thief is eligible for the 4 or 5-fold payment. So we're now saying, and we're going to end off on this note, well, how then does it accord with the rabbis? Okay, so the Gemara rejects this suggestion by explaining how Rav Papa's explanation of the brisa can accord with the rabbis as well. Okay, it might be that the brisa refers to where the buyer says, that which you have stolen shall not be acquired by me until it rests on the ground. Meaning, basically, although Kenyan chatzir can effect acquisition of an item as soon as it enters the airspace confined by the chatzir's walls, it will not do so if it was specifically stipulated that the acquisition shall be delayed until some later point. So we can say that the brisa, which exempts the thief from the 4-fold or 5-fold payment on account of his simultaneous Sabbath desecration, refers to where the buyer is very specific and stipulated that the sale will not take effect until the animal lands on the ground. In that case, the thief incurs liability to the 4-fold or 5-fold payment only when the animal lands on the ground, which is simultaneous in terms of time span with his liability for Sabbath desecration, according to the rabbis. Okay? So good. I think, guys, we can end on that note. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you.
So Damon, okay, so then you actually said it. Acquisition has to land on the ground. That's the type of Kenyan also.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. What we're saying is here, it doesn't. What we're saying is that the buyer made that specification.
Ah, okay.
He
the
said,
buyer.
listen, I don't care about gravity in mid-air. I don't know if you've got some impy there that's going to grab it halfway before it lands on the ground and try and pull it up the fence. I don't know if you've got ropes that you threw the carcass, I put the money to the fence, and you're quickly roping it up before it touched on the ground. So we're going to make it to where it's on the ground, and I can now drag it in my property. Yeah. So
okay, because like let's say, okay, so the transaction. Because I was thinking of like someone they throws the object into the public domain from a private domain. And as long as no one picks it up, then surely there could also be a case for no liability.
No, you can't throw from a public. You can't take from a public to a private. What we're saying is here, the rabbis never penalized if Gavin was my next door neighbor and I threw an apple across and it was in the airspace of a public road, as long as it didn't land in the public road. We don't penalize for airspace if it travels from private to private and there's a road in between. It's not recommended, because especially my aim sucks. But we're saying, according to Rabbi Akiva, that's breaking Shabbos, because it enters the airspace from private to public and then from public to private. Either way, it's a problem. So with regards to this, it's a difficulty, because Rabbi Akiva would say it's no difficulty. That sale took place in airspace because it's going to land. Breaking Shabbos took place in airspace, it's going to land. Happened simultaneously. There's no 4 or 5-fold payment in this particular case, because there's a death penalty. And then the rabbis have a problem, because then the rabbis would have to explain, why there's no 4 or 5-fold penalty, especially if the Kenyan took place in midair, because a financial transaction can. The minute it leaves your property, like at the garage, what happens is you put your money in a slot, and then they take it underneath when you're buying bread or whatever. You can't get it back. But the minute it's midair, it's gone. You can't get it back. So then the transaction took place then, but the breaking of Shabbos, according to the rabbis, is only when that article actually lands in the public domain. So that's not Kimle B'di Rabbi Minay, because it's 2 separate time periods. It's not a simultaneous transaction. So they're saying, how do the rabbis work this one out with Rav Papa? It's when the buyer stipulated that the transaction only takes place when the animal carcass lands. That's it. All right, Kev, you got to teach now. Have a great day. Arth, keep on, my friends.
Shkar, Damon. Tomorrow 5 o'clock.
Yeah. Arth, I hope you're feeling better, mate. All the best, guys.
Cheers. Thank you. Shkar, thanks for the time. Thanks for accommodating me.